All right, so let's get into our materials. All of our materials are down here inside of Cinema. You can go to Create and you can go to Shader, and all of these are different starting points, different calculations, different options you would have for materials. But for most of the stuff that we're going to do, we could just double click right inside this view, and that will just create a material. And these are just basic materials that we start off with, and then we make them super awesome as we progress along. There are some other ones, like to release 20, this Uber material is new, and to release 19, I believe this PBR material is new, maybe 18. We're not going to get into those right now. Eventually we'll get into it. The same thing with these node materials. We'll get into more of those later. But for now, we're just going to learn the basics of it. All right, so every material has options. If you just look at it down here, you don't see the same display. You do have it. It's under basic. Here's these same options here that are right there. But if you go to color, here's the color information. If I click on color, if you go to reflectance, there's reflectance. But obviously here I can click on any one of these and see what their tab is. There I can only see which ones are checked. Okay, so typically I'll double click so I can see the whole thing. It's important to name stuff, so whatever you want to call something, let's say this is wood, I would give it the name of wood. And then we have to look at each parameter here. And we're going to only look at a few of these, but just so you can see what they do. So color is essentially the color of the item. Okay, what is the color of it? Sometimes you'll see this also called diffuse. We can collapse this. We can click on that and use another slider for whatever reason. You can use the eyedropper. You can switch this to RGB if you don't like the HSV, or you can switch it to Kelvin. Or hex, or any of these different options. Typically, I'll leave it as HSV. You can also control the brightness. Even though this says 100%, you can go higher than 100% to make it kind of like fluorescent or really luminescent. They also will have these things. Anywhere you see these arrows here, that means you can add a texture to it. So this is something inside of Cinema where I can come down and say, okay, well, I want to do a gradient, okay, instead of a solid color. And when I do that, you'll see this gradient is here, and that gradient name is popped up there, and then I can click on this, and I can edit the gradient. Okay? Don't be afraid to play with these to get the look of it correct. A lot of the tools are going to be set up differently, so you really have to just kind of go in there and not be afraid to click around. So I'm going to go with this bluish color, and then I'll double click here, and then I'll go with this lighter blue, and then I'll double click there, and then I'll go with, let's say, pink. Okay, so now I have this gradient. The kind of gradient is based off of these. Different ways that I want this gradient to play out. You don't just have the linear and the radial like you would in Photoshop. You actually have a whole bunch of different options that you could play with to get different settings. Okay, to get back to the original color, I can just go back to color. And if I want to get rid of that, I click on this arrow, and then I say clear, and then that gets rid of it. If I click on this this bar here, or I click on the dots there, I can actually bring in an image and then use that as a texture. Okay. Again, if I want to clear it, I can clear it. I can also go to the dot and say load image and click on the image. I could also clear that again. Click on this big bar, and that'll automatically bring me up too. So several different ways to get to that same spot. This right now is being used as the color. So once that happens, this has no effect on it at all. Okay. If I go down here to mix and I say, let's say add, well, now I can add, a little tint to that texture if I wanted to. And then I can play with this mix strength to control, which is, there. Typically you would leave it as normal. All right, so that's color. So we can give it a color. Under trends or luminance, this is the brightness of it. So if I change these settings, nothing is going to happen until I check the box. So I check the box, and now it's kind of like a glowing. Okay, and we'll see an example of that in a little bit. But now it's kind of like lighting it up. If I have luminance, I don't need a light in the scene for that to be showing up. You typically will have lights, but I don't need a light for this to show up. Okay, so if I have a darker scene, I want a button to glow. That's where I could use that. I also have transparency, and by default, the transparency is gone, like you see nothing there. As you play with this refraction amount, as you crank this up higher and higher, you'll see more of that glass-like look that's appearing here. And the higher this number, the more refraction you're going to get. they have these presets, which are basically like the actual numbers that you would use. So if this is glass, I would go to glass, and this punches in the actual refraction number for glass. Everything that reflects and is transparent has this thing called the index of refraction. And basically, if I go to Wikipedia, they have a little chart inside here that shows you, okay, if it's just a vacuum, which is typically like, perfect environment, it's 1. If it's air, then it's like 1.000293. It might as well be 1, as far as we're concerned. When you get into water, though, you'll see waters is about 1.3. When you get into flint glass, 1.62. When you get into diamond, it's 2.42. Okay, so these are starting point numbers, and if you need to tweak it a little bit, then tweak it a little bit. But ideally, if you go in here and say, okay, I want something that looks like a diamond, you'll see that automatically jumps the number up to that 2.417 number, and then I could adjust it from there. We also have things like roughness or blurriness in here. So if I wanted this glass to not be crystal clear, I can crank the blurriness up. There it goes. It takes a second to load or refresh, but you'll see now instead of it being perfectly clear, now it's a bit blurry. Okay. You can also change the color of the glass by giving a little tint here, or going to color and adjusting the color here. Now because I have that metal on here, we're not really seeing it too much. Let me just clear that metal. Okay, so it's blue. Let's go back to our transparency. We'll give it that same color blue. Oops, too much. See, if we go too much on this, we'll actually lose the transparency, so we don't want to go too much on there. There we go. And now we have that. You could also do absorption color and give that a color as well too. Anytime you're adjusting these colors and you're trying to look at what they're doing, pick a different color. Like if I were to pick, green in this case, it would be obvious inside here where that green is affecting. Let me take all my color back to white. There we go. Oops. So now I can see exactly what that absorption color is doing. And some of these will be based off of the size of an object. So this is absorption distance. If I have a huge object, I'm going to need a huge number here. If I have a small object, I'm going to need a smaller number here. Okay, so just something that this is a preview. It's not locked in stone that these numbers will work perfectly for every single object that we have. Okay, let me set this back to white. You could also add textures to these, so like everything else, you could add a texture. So if I wanted under surfaces, I can go to noise, or sorry, effects, I can go to noise. Nope, under there is noise. And then what this will do is it'll give you just a little bit of not perfect glass look to it. Okay, so instead of it being perfectly clear, perfectly diamond all the way through, it'll break that up some. And again, that could be a nice look to it. I can click on this, I can adjust the kind of noise, maybe take the scale up a bit, and so on. Okay, so that'll give me a different kind of look to that transparency. And then we have a reflection. Under the type here, I'm going to go and change this to Beckman. These top four are typically, for what we're doing, they're pretty close. When you get into more exact things, you can play with them a bit more, but for our purposes, we can just stick with Beckman. For the roughness, this is going to be how rough the item is. Okay, so let's look at just this. I'm going to take the reflection strength all the way up, and we can see that this is a crystal clear reflection. As I take the roughness up, it takes that reflection and roughens it up. Okay, so it basically blurs the reflection. If it goes all the way up, you can see that we don't even see that reflection at all. Okay, so sometimes you'll have an item that has some reflection, some roughness, and really you have to just be able to analyze the surface. There's also specular strength, and you can see that those big bright white lights in there, as I pull these down, pull these up, is just kind of enhancing that a bit more. And then all of these is hard to see, but there's a little arrow next to them. You could add textures for each one of these. And typically the more you get into making realistic looking items, you will have textures for roughness and for reflection and for specular. Okay, there's even other stuff down here, but we're going to keep it simplish and just do the basics of there. Okay. The next one we'll talk about is bump. And so bump is basically going to allow us to add a surfaces, there we go, checkerboard. add a bumpy type surface to our stuff. I'm going to take this to, let's say, 10 and 10. Okay, now we can see that this has, some bumpiness all over it, and then the amount of the bump is controlled by this strength. Okay, it'll go from 0 with like no bump to negative, so it bumps one way, or positive, it bumps the other way. Okay, and again, because we have that bar there, typically we would bring in a picture, or we might add, let's say, noise to this, just so we don't have a perfectly clean surface. Okay, sometimes you have a surface, you just want it to look kind of like scuffed up a bit. You would add that to bump. Normal is like bump, except it's typically something that we would generate from a separate program. Bump we can generate in Photoshop. Normal we would typically need a separate program altogether that we can generate. Alpha is transparency, so if we wanted a part of our item to be invisible, we could, let's say, add a surfaces checkerboard here, and you'll see that this is now transparent. I'm going to turn off my reflection. There we go. And now we can see how it's like see-through. Okay. Let's go cube. There we go. If I change this to a cube, you can see where those areas where the checkerboard is hitting, we can see straight through it. All right. So if I had a texture I want to drop on here, or an item that was kind of oblong or odd shaped, I may use something like that. I could also say don't be soft. I can also say invert if I want it to be the opposite. Okay. Typically a black and white picture. Black will be not transparent and white will be transparent. So I set this to black. Try it again. There we go. Sorry, black was transparent and white is not transparent. And now it's just screwing with me now. Back to there. It must not have updated, and now it's updating. Let's just undo our stuff. There we go. Okay. Regardless, you can play with it. Some softwares will use it backwards. Some softwares it'll be white is opaque, white is transparent, and some it's reversed, whatever. So you want to make sure that, if it is coming in opposite, then you can just invert it or flip it or whatever. Okay. Turn it off. And then we have glow, which is glow. So it'll make your object glow. And when you have this on, typically inside of your render settings, you'll also have this object glow that gets added under effects, object glow. Okay. And then it's just an effect. There's no options for it. Cool. Let me delete that. Let me turn this off. And then this class, we won't be getting into displacements, but basically a displacement allows you to take that bump map and actually make it bump out. A bump looks like it's bumpy, but a displacement actually bumps it out and just like increases it. Okay, so those are the basics of materials. So I'm going to just delete that wood material, and I'm going to assign a material to different ones of these. So I already assigned my sky to that background I showed you. I'm going to grab the brick and add it to that one. And let's render this out. I reset my render settings to standard, turned off global illumination, all that, just so this would happen a little bit quicker so we can see it. Physical takes forever, so usually I'll work in standard, and then when I'm ready, I'll switch to physical. So there's brick. Now let's look at what brick consists of. So on the color, I found a picture of brick, and for all of my textures that I get, typically I go through textures.com. You can look up different materials, textures, that kind of thing. Simply type in what you want, brick. Go past these circular ones. These ones, usually you have to have a separate account in order to download, or they don't have everything. Okay, so here's some brick ones, so you can click on here, you can log in, and then you can download. You typically want the largest size you can get. These bottom three are premium only, but the top two, well, in this case, the top one is the only one that is able to download. here, these two are able to download. The other three are premium only. So you have to be a member to get the full-blown or paying member. So you would download this, and then I just connected. I put it in my textures folder, and then I just connected to that brick texture. There it is. And then I just right-clicked or left-clicked here, and then I copied this, and then I went to Reflectance, and then I adjusted it onto my layer color. I added it there, and then I also added it to my roughness. Okay, not a whole lot of reflection here, so I pulled the reflection down. I have a lot of roughness on top of this. And then on the bump, I did the same thing. I added it into the bump, and then I pulled that strength all the way down to -1. Now on here, I'm looking at it, and I wanted to make sure that these rivets or these bumps go inward. If I went the other way on here, the grout would actually look like it's coming out of the lines and not going into the bars. So that's why it's negative, so it doesn't do that. Okay, so that's really all I did here is I made it Beckman. I cranked up the roughness and made it, put that texture on, tick that down. I added it to this layer color down here, and then I can add that back in. Let me multiply it. There we go. All right, and then I'm able to get this thing. It looks pretty much like brick. Now this is just using the same exact image for all of these. Typically you wouldn't do that. Typically you would want to have different images for your color and your reflectance and your bump. When you use a colored image on something like reflection or something like bump, it's basically using the brightness of it to create all of this. So in these white areas, it's going to be, let's say, more or less reflective, okay? In this case, more rough. So in these white areas, it's going to be more rough, which is why we don't see a whole lot of reflection there. And then it'll also be more bumpy in the white areas, and then in the black areas, it'll be less rough, so it'll be shinier, and it'll be less bumpy. If I go to my reflection and I crank that reflection strength up, and we render it, we should be able to see a little bit better what that, what that reflection is doing. Okay, so you can see it's obviously a lot more reflective in that case. All right, so oops, pull that back up. Pull the reflection strength back down. Okay, so that's how I would do something like that, or just grabbing a texture. Now, the deeper you get into 3D, you'll start playing with software like this, which is called Substance. And this is basically allows me to create textures that have the appropriate channels. So this one is, let me close this. This one is not using a picture for the metal here and the wood there and the leather here. It's using what are called procedural textures, which mean that if I were to go into this leather folder and I went down to base color, I can take the color of this and make this really whatever color I want, just right inside the software itself. If I wanted more adjustments of my leather, I can go to this, and I could take that scaling up or down on the leather to control what that scaling of that pattern looks like. I can also go into where do I want to play with that? Do I play here? No, height, yes. There we go. So I'm just playing with some of that distance just to spread those out a little bit more. I could also go in there and turn things off. So I don't want as much damage or any damage. I can just turn these things on and off. And the same thing with the wood. I can control the wood grain, the pattern. I can go to, on this one, I can control the metal. And then what would happen in this case is that this would actually export out the textures. So over here, these are the textures that it's generating for this specific object. So when you get into something where it's like, okay, I want metal, wood, leather, and then, another kind of metal or leather or whatever, this is the process for it to create these kinds of things. And then when I hit C on my keyboard, this is showing me what the flat color looks like. So in order for that to look as good as it does, like this is the flat coloring for it. This is the height map, which is used for bumpiness. This is the roughness, so you can see how rough it is in certain areas and how smooth it is in other areas. This is the metallic, so that's the reflection. This is the normal, and then this is the normal with height. Now it's kind of subtle. I mean, if you zoom in, you can really see it. But there is some kind of bumpiness happening on top of there. okay? So all of those things would go into an object to get it to look realistic. So instead of just grabbing the same brick texture for color and reflectance and bump, I would go into substance, I would make textures for things and then bring them into here. The workflow for that's more than this lecture, so we're not doing that, okay? But I just want you to see those things. Let's go here to reflectance, and I'll drop the reflectance on that one. And then we'll take a look and see. And you'll see, hey, that looks like a chrome sphere. So we'll double click it and we'll take a look at the settings. So chrome has no color, so I just got rid of the color completely. I went to reflection, changed it to Beckman, no roughness, full reflection, full specular. That's what it is. Now, if I wanted this to look kind of like, let's say, spotty or dirty or something, let's say that I went to my color here, and instead of it being, just an actual color, I'm going to go to texture and I'm going to add a noise pattern. And then on this noise pattern, I'm going to pick something that is very contrasted. So piezo, let's say. I don't know what all of them do, but I just kind of go through and start there. I'm going to take my contrast up. So here's my contrast. So lots of black and white, you can see. And as that adds into this, you'll see that the color is black in all these areas and white in those other areas. Let's see, octaves. No, go down with octaves. Too much? There we go. Maybe I'll take the scale up a little bit. Okay. All right, that's good. So now I'm going to take this and I'm just going to copy it. And then I'm going to go to my reflectance. And under reflection strength, because right now everything is reflecting, even though there's white here, it's still reflecting perfectly there. I'm going to open up my reflection strength, go to my texture and paste that. And then I'm going to invert it. So I'm going to click on this, and somewhere inside here, typically there is an invert. Let's back on this. Nope, I don't see an invert. That's not a big deal. All I have to do is just swap the colors. So this will be white, and that will be black. There we go. So now under color, it's black and white, and under reflection, it's white and black. And so now when I render this, now we have this surface that looks like it's not perfectly clean. And I can obviously go into the color, and instead of it being black and white, maybe my white marks are, let's say orange, like a dark orange, like a rusty kind of color. And even on these, if I open this up, you'll get the same hue saturation value sliders you were getting before. So again, neat stuff you can do. Under bump here, there we go. I could also paste that same texture here. And now instead of these being flat, they will actually have some bump to it. And it might be subtle, so I may have to crank that up some more. Yeah, not seeing a huge difference in that, but it's there. Okay, sometimes you'll see more of a difference than, oops, I guess I don't see it at all. Sometimes your mind plays tricks with you. Now we turn the bump on, now we can actually see the bumpiness. Now we can turn it down to an appropriate level. Even further. Okay, so the more you get into these textures and the more you start playing with them, you can really do some amazing things. Now you'll see that that environment sky, that's what's reflecting in here. If that wasn't there, we wouldn't be getting those nice reflections. Let's go there. Let's turn off our environment sky. You'll see we get this kind of like ugliness happening there. All right, so let's close that. Let's see, what else do we have? Glass. So let's add glass to, I'm going to add glass to this cube. And when I do that, it just adds it on top. It's kind of weird. I'm just going to take the brick and then delete the brick. And I'll take the brick and just add it to that cylinder back there. Now you can see glass is obviously going to take a bit longer to render out because of how it's set up. Okay, it looks pretty neat. Let's look at the settings while we're in here. So reflectance has that layer color, so I added a little bit of green into this layer color here to give it some green in the reflections. Under transparency, I added some green to the absorption color. I changed this to emerald. And then under color, I again gave it that green tint. And then this is what we get with that. And remember, we can also take the transparency to, a blurrier image. Let's say 50. And then we can render this again, and that reflection, that glass, instead of it being fully see-through and crystal clear, will now have a softness to it, kind of like a green cube, like a plastic cube that has like the edges or the outside edges sanded a little bit. All right, so it's almost done now. It's done now. So that took 2 minutes for that to render out. But you can see the obviously difference between clear glass and that blurred out glass. Okay, so you can get a lot of cool results. Now sometimes you may not want any textures on there at all, just flat coloring, and that's fine too. Like if I grab this one, this is basically just a, you may want something just flat. So there's a color that I have that metal on there. The reflection has that same metal for roughness and this, and then it has a bump. Okay, it's very similar to the other one. You may want just a flat color. So the ground itself has basically just a flat color, and under reflection, I changed it to Beckman Still and cranked the roughness up and took the reflection off. And what this does is just gives you maybe a little bit of roughness is fine. It just gives you just an overall like nice flat color that goes around the entire thing. So sometimes you do want that. I also have this glow. So this one I went to the color, changed it, luminance up a bit, reflection, high roughness, and medium reflection. If I went the other way, this would be very reflective and might look odd, depending on the kind of surface you're going for. So I'll drop that onto, let's say, that one. And of course, make sure object glow is turned on here. And I'm going to turn off that glass because I think that glass is just going to take forever to render. Now the glow you're not going to be able to see until after it's all done. So it's obviously important to pay attention to because, hey, here it is. If we don't see any glow, once the entire image gets done, you'll see it just like pop in. And the glow is an after effect. It's a post effect that happens on top of your rendering. There we go. So it happened. It's very subtle in this case. Let me go to the glow settings and luminance. Oh, I didn't turn glow on. Dang it. There we go. Now under glow, which should have it on there, you can play with the radius and the strength. I'm not sure why I turned it off, but at some point I turned it off. All right, so now we should be able to see it come into play right after it's done with the sides. There we go. So now we can see there's a definite glow happening around there. Sometimes it's really subtle where it's just the bare edges. But again, this is something that you would have to play with. Okay. Now one last thing I want to go over just so we can see this is as I drop materials and textures on here, obviously they're getting placed differently. So I'm going to erase all the materials that I have on these objects. And I'm just going to put the brick on all of them. Now notice if I put the brick on this geo, because they're in a group, all of them get the material assigned. If I drop them on each individual one, then just the one gets it. Okay. Now there's advantages to doing both. I'm going to click on this and go to attributes, and this has options. So if I click on that, I can actually go into here and say how I want the texture to be laid out. You can see on the sphere the brick looks horrible, but like the cubes look fine. You know, this is huge, like the brick is really big there. So the way it's projecting right now is based off of a UVW. So we'll get more into that later. But for now, we can just play with some of these basic settings. Basically anything that's up here, if we set this to spherical, you know, maybe that'll give us good results. Cylindrical, flat. Flat is basically projecting it in a flat direction from the front. So the sides are really stretched out in all of these. Cubic, and cubic in this case is going to look the best, but you'll see like on the sphere how we get this spot where it comes in like this, but then there's like brick going this way and it kind of clashes. And then there's frontal, which is basically whichever way the camera is facing, that's how the texture gets projected. And then spatial is just based off of their own space in the world. Typically I don't use that one. So let's say that we used flat. Over here on the left is our texture. So if we click that, we can grab the move tool and actually move this, or we can rotate it, or we can scale that texture up. Okay, so if we wanted it just from this angle, that might be fine. If we're doing something where we're spinning around and seeing all the different angles, well, maybe that wouldn't be fine. Okay, now this is why it's important where this is, because if it's up here, it's one for all of these. But if it's on each individual one, and I'm just control dragging to each one of these, I can basically pick a different one for each one. So for my cube, I can click on that and say, okay, well, cubic actually works pretty good for that. Okay. If I don't like how it's being placed, I'm going to go to my coordinates and just reset all these. There we go. And then I can scale it up. And now that looks pretty good. Okay. I'll do the same thing to, I could do the same thing to the other cube. It's the same exact process. 0, set all my scales to 1, or even set them to like, I knew I scaled it up anyway, so let's say 200. That's actually pretty close. Let's scale that down some. Okay. For my cylinder, let's go to the coordinates and reset all these again. It might make sense to have this as cylinder, right? And then even rotate. I'm not sure why it's rotated. Weirdly. Oh, because it's that cylinder. Oops. There we go. Now, if I have something like the top of this, I can actually assign materials to individual pieces. So if I click on this cylinder here and I hit C, I can grab those faces maybe I'll also go to select and grow the selection so it grabs a little bit of that edge. Grow selection, there it is. And then I can grab the brick and drop it right on top of that selection. And you'll see we get this extra thing here, and then I can still get an extra tag and then still control how this is being laid out. So I can set that to flat, go back to this, and then control just that on its own. Okay, so I can do that for obviously every single one of these. UVW is where you really get into being able to control it a lot more. But just so you can see, this is the basic of how to get those materials laid out in some sort of fashion. Like I said, again, we'll get more into it as we go. But that's going to be the nitty-gritty for just the basics of materials on objects.